Today we're going to talk about fungi, those party organisms of the kingdoms. You've probably seen things that look like this on your way to and from school or in your neighborhood or even in your local grocery store. Originally, we used to think that they were part of the plant kingdom, which makes sense because they look kind of plant-like and they grow out of the ground. So we're going to look at a few characteristics today of what makes them specifically a different kingdom than the plant kingdom. Take a moment, look over the learning goals so you know what to focus on for this lesson, and then hit play when you're ready. So we've moved on from those really simple organisms like bacteria, the unicellular prokaryotes, and we're getting to things that are a lot more complex. So when we're talking about fungi, we're talking about things that are multicellular. We are not looking at single cells, but cells that are able to be combined together, which allows organisms to be able to be more complex. We can have cells that are creating the outside of the organism, cells that allow food to move throughout the organism, cells that allow reproduction to happen over longer distances. So when we're looking at fungi, we're looking at that multicellular, and they're heterotrophic. So they are going to be feeding on other things to get their energy, and of course eukaryotic. So they have a nucleus and they have those membrane-bound organelles. Keep in mind, you can have things that are unicellular in eukaryotes, much like our protists, but you're not going to have anything that is a multicellular prokaryote. And again, prokaryotes are just not complex enough to be able to communicate with other cells, and you need that when you have a multicellular organism. So one big difference between them and plants is that they lack chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what gives plants that green color, and you're not going to see too many fungi that are looking green. The really big thing is when we talk about them being heterotrophic, we're not talking about the way that we go and we eat things. These are actually things that are able to absorb nutrients from their environment. So what happens is that they're able to release enzymes into the environment, and they kind of pre-digest the food. So those enzymes break down whatever they happen to be growing on or around so that it breaks them down into nutrients that can actually just be absorbed through the actual cells themselves. And we call these kind of things decomposers. A really crucial role in the ecosystems to take those things that are dead, and sometimes some things that are living as well, if they're parasites, and be able to break down those nutrients as well. Another big difference that we're going to be looking at between fungi and plants is that the cell wall of fungi is made of something called ketone. When you happen to look at something like a mushroom, a fungi, the thing that you see actually poking out is like the fruit of the fungi. So we call that the cap. And this is where a lot of the reproduction is going to happen. Because it's above ground, it's able to actually release little things called spores. And we'll get back to that in a second. But release that into the air so that they can actually spread their seed, literally, and reproduce. Another really important structure that fungi have is something called hyphae. And there are these thin filaments, almost like threads, that are surrounded by cell walls, and they have these little gaps in between them that allow different nutrients and different parts of the cell even to travel between cells. Now, one thing that's really cool is that the stuff that you see above ground, those caps, the fruiting bodies, those are just the smallest part of fungi. And most of what exists underground. So we get these little mats of these threads, and they're called mycelium. And a lot of times they're tangled together, and you have them generally a much bigger size than any of the mushrooms that you'll see above. In this picture here is what a lot of scientists consider the largest organism on Earth. So we're going to talk a little bit about that word, symbiotic. So we get these massive networks of all of these little thread-like structures, and they live with plants to help plants grow. What happens is that the fungi are able to break down some of those organisms in the ground, and the plants are able to then feed on those nutrients that the fungi have actually broken down. When we're looking at reproduction, fungi reproduce through spores. So they're tiny little cells that are like that hyphae that's broken off that can, because they're so small, they can actually travel through the air, by wind, or even attach themselves to an animal. So a couple of examples of where you might have seen these things in the world. If you've ever been in a kind of damp area, sometimes in your bathroom, you might see some of that black stuff along the sides, so mold or mildew. That would be a type of fungi. And you also have mildews that will grow on plants. Sometimes when you happen to have you grab a fruit and there might be some part that looks like it's rotted out, or you get some of that white powdery stuff over things like grapes, then you're actually looking at a fungi that is growing over the fruit. So some fungi can be parasitic, which means that they will actually feed on living organisms, not just dead things. So one type of fungi that you're probably a little bit more familiar with is yeast. So yeast is a little bit of an exception in that these are unicellular, and these are used often when it comes to creating, when baking goods. They feed on the sugars to create gases. And when you're eating bread and so on, you see those little kind of like holes throughout them. It's because the yeast is eating some of the sugar in the ingredients, creating those gas and making that kind of light and fluffy. They do the same with alcohol. So they feed on the sugars inside of the fruit, create those bubbles, and are able to change things like sugar into alcohol, which is actually a form of sugar itself. So take a look through the key questions, see how well you understood this lesson, and we'll take them up tomorrow. See you then.